Hello, and welcome to this Beverly cluster of congregations Thanksgiving service, where churches come together for Feed Your Neighbor. The Beverly cluster is a program from some congregations in South Toledo to feed people in need and provide for other support in the community. And there is typically an annual Thanksgiving service from the combined congregations in the Beverly cluster. Last year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we didn't have a service, and this year's circumstance is that only 2 churches are taking part. And the ministers, me, Reverend Ed Heilman, pastor of Park Congregational United Church of Christ, and the Reverend T.K. Barger, senior minister at First Unitarian Universalist Church of Toledo, are presenting the entire service in light of the limitations imposed by the pandemic. For our opening words, Reverend Tim and I will share a responsive reading. We lift up our hearts in thanks by Richard M. Fox. For the sun and the dawn, which we did not create.
For the moon and the evening, which we did not make.
For food, which we plant, but cannot grow.
For friends and loved ones, we have not earned and cannot buy.
For this gathered company, which welcomes us as we are from wherever we have come.
For all our free churches that keep us human and encourage us in our quest for beauty, truth, and love.
For all things which come to us as gifts, being from sources beyond ourselves.
Gifts of life and love and friendship, we lift up our hearts in thanks this day. And as it's Thanksgiving, we want to draw some attention, honor even, to the bread and food, that this is a feast day. Its origins in North America go back to a feast, even though there were some challenges you might hear about later in the service. But we do want to give proper honor to nutrition, to sustenance, and to company in sharing meals together. And we have thanks for what we do have. And please join us for a time of meditation, contemplation, and prayer. We know that Thanksgiving is meant to be a joyful celebration, but families aren't always as together as we want. Hunger continues and can't be solved by a one-day feast. And life goes on. While there is good in praise, grief can be nearby. Reverend Ed and I will share this Thanksgiving meditation written by Naomi King. Every day we experience hunger and yearning
For food, for approval, for respect, for love.
for meaningful work, for any and enough work,
For home, for family, for friends.
for health, for healing, for hope,
For the departed, for the newly arrived.
for the green trees, for the cool, clean waters,
For shade in the heat of the day, and for stars to light the velvet night. Every day we are invited anew to be thankful.
for food, for approval, for respect, for love,
For meaningful work, for any and enough work.
for home, for family, for friends,
For health, for healing, for hope.
for the departed, for the newly arrived,
For the green trees, for the cool, clean waters,
for shade in the heat of the day, and for stars to light the velvet night.
our hearts beating in liberating flight. We soar in gratitude for all the gifts we have in this day, in this lifetime of being, and turn again to share the bounty with all that is.
To conclude this time of meditation, contemplation, and prayer, let's have 1 minute of silence.
Amen, and blessed be.
Pastor Ed, have we figured out how to solicit contributions for Feed Your Neighbor, which is the recipient of these Thanksgiving services?
I think the best thing we could do is to invite people to send a check to the church or to the Unitarian Universalist Association, and with the notation, Feed Your Neighbor, and we will make sure we pass it on. If you want to make a direct donation, that also could be done, but we don't have that information in front of us, so you would need to look it up.
So for us, I know you can go to uutoledo.org and click on Give or Giving and be able to follow some prompts that way. But if you send a paper check, yes, please do mark it for Feed Your Neighbor so we know which category to put it in.
And we hope someday to catch up to the Unitarian Church in knowing how to do these things. I think it's wonderful that you do. Bless you all for what you give. It helps.
And would you dedicate the offering?
Yes, let's. We dedicate this offering in thanksgiving for the support and good work of Feed Your Neighbor. You get 2 sermons today, but I won't make mine too terribly long, so you won't have to suffer. I was in a restaurant the other day and having a feast, and this is Thanksgiving feast time. And the waitress came up and asked me a question. But I had food in my mouth, and my mother taught me not to talk with my mouth full. So I waited a little while, and then I answered her. I said, my mother raised me not to talk with my mouth full. But then I said, what do I do when my mouth is half full? Should I consider it empty? Or should I consider it full? It's the glass is half empty or half full, only it was my mouth. So what is it? Are we okay? Are we full? Or are we empty? Usually we're really somewhere in between. It depends on if we're looking at those we think have it better than us, or those we think have it worse than us. In a sense, we need to have gratitude for what we have and gratitude for what we don't have. One person was driving across a bridge and there was some ice and they slipped and crashed and went into the river and the car turned upside down and they were able to get out and they lived, and they said, "Thanks be to God." another person drove over the bridge and nothing happened at all. Who should be the most grateful? Well, we know the one that got out of the car in the water was probably the more grateful one. But the more blessed one was actually the one who simply drove across. So please remember not only all of the blessings and good things you have in your life, but have some gratitude for all of the bad things that you don't have in your life. And let's all be merciful to one another, because we all are probably half full. So happy Thanksgiving, beautiful children of God, of the mystery of light and love. May you be full of joy as your life is half full of blessings and sorrows.
Pastor Ed, before we get to my interminably long sermon, would you play us a little bit of music?
This is we are more known, for our, we went to seminary and we didn't necessarily take music, so be gracious to us, we hope. This is in the parlor.
In a service at First Unitarian Church of Toledo on November 28th, 1920, the Mayflower Compact was read. I will share it now. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof, we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, the 54th. Anno Domini 1620. At our service, the minister then said, "The Lord our God be with us, as he was with our fathers." And the congregation responded, "That he may incline our hearts unto him, to keep his commandments and to walk in his ways." At the Thanksgiving service at First Unitarian Church of Toledo 101 years ago, though it had the long title, a service in commemoration of the tercentenary of the landing of the Pilgrim Fathers. The sermon given by Reverend Horace Westwood was titled "The New Puritanism." Today, for our traditional Beverly Cluster Thanksgiving service, I'm speaking on Pilgrims in Perspective. I don't know what Reverend Westwood's approach was to the New Puritanism at the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, but I wonder if he could have included words trying to address the positives of living in community inspired by intentions of these separatists who would come to be called pilgrims from 1620, crossing an ocean to build what they hoped would be beloved community. More likely, what with Prohibition having started in January of 1920, he was talking about the experience of free expression being limited by people trying to impose their own ideas of what is right and not respecting others to make their own choices, much like we see today with people trying to turn the clock back and legislate restrictions on who can marry, to deny women having control over their own bodies, and to restrict common human rights. There will probably always be a Puritan strain in American society. But people change, and they change society. We don't view Thanksgiving like Americans did 100 years ago, do we? We've grown more conscious that, yes, the people who lived on this continent when Europeans arrived had their own nations and were civilized. And it's rare to hear the term Pilgrim Fathers. In 2021, 401 years after the 1620 landing of what were called the Pilgrim Fathers at Plymouth Rock on Cape Cod of what is now Massachusetts, though their intended destination was Virginia, we're in the midst of a nearing 2 years worldwide pandemic, and our way of community during this has become primarily through electronic connection rather than in person, because COVID-19 has characteristics to spread throughout an assembly of people. But it's also Thanksgiving, an annual national holiday, and a time when we think of pilgrims and Puritans, of people coming to a land new to them to form their vision of a new kind of civilization. 101 years ago, it seems that the attitude of Americans, some of us descendants of those pilgrims and Puritans, was that the people already resident here were happy to provide land to newcomers and to assist the new neighbors in learning how to make the land work for them with good practices in agriculture. And there was a solid acceptance that the white settlers possessed supremacy, and their Christianity gave them dominion over the world, including people who didn't know about Jesus. Today we have more of an idea that, yes, the colonizers were displacing communities and imposing their own society rather than adapting to and melding with the people whose land they moved near or on. The First Nations people were expected to adapt to European ways, not to live their own lives and adjust with the newcomers to form a common society for all. I note that the Pilgrims and the Puritans were different groups. We put them together, especially at Thanksgiving time, but there's some difference of belief and of their path from England to what was called the New World. The Plymouth colonizers were pilgrims, not using that term at the time, but rather separatists. I think both Pilgrims and Puritans, soon after the Mayflower, Puritans arrived and settled close by, used the term saints too, for their assumptions of having religious favor. Both Park Church's denomination, the United Church of Christ, and First Unitarians, the Unitarian Universalist Association, have their roots in New England churches, with the separatist Pilgrims and then the more general Puritans. The UCC of today were Congregationalists then, their Calvinism being state-sponsored religion according to what was called the Standing Order. And Unitarian congregations broke away from the Congregationalists, often reorienting the existing churches, and then made efforts to have their Unitarian independence recognized by the state. Back to the 1620s and more of a traditional Pilgrim perspective. Here is an excerpt from a sermon in Plymouth, New England, December 1621, given by Robert Cushman, a Pilgrim who was a leader and organizer for the Mayflower voyage, but who didn't cross the ocean on that ship, instead arriving on the Fortune in 1621. The Mayflower Pilgrims had returned to England from Holland so they could have the king's support in establishing their New England. From Cushman's sermon. And whoso rightly considereth what manner of entrance, abiding, and proceedings we have had amongst those poor heathens since we came hither, will easily think that God hath some great work to do towards them. They were wont to be the most cruelest and treacherousest people in all these parts, even like lions. But to us they have been like lambs, so kind, so submissive and trusty, as a man may truly say, many Christians are not so kind nor sincere. They are very much wasted of late, by reason of a great mortality that fell amongst them 3 years since, which together with their own civil dissensions and bloody wars hath so wasted them, as I think the 12th person is scarce left alive. And those that are left have their courage much abated, and their countenance is defected, and they seem as people affrighted. I'm seeing some illness parallels from what's said to be their plague to today's pandemic. And I hope we will do better and won't have colonizers coming. Cushman continues the introductory part of his sermon. And though when we came first into the country we were few, and many of us were sick, and many died by reason of the cold and wet, it being the depth of winter, and we having no houses nor shelter, yet when there was not 6 of able persons among us, and that they came daily to us by hundreds, with their sachems or kings, and might in 1 hour have made a dispatch of us, yet such a fear was upon them, as that they never offered us the least injury in word or deed. And by reason of one Tisquanto, that lives among us, that can speak English, we have daily commerce with their kings, and can know what is done or intended towards us among the savages. Also we can acquaint them with our courses and purposes, both humane and religious. And the greatest commander of the country, called Massasoit, cometh often to visit us, though he live 50 miles from us, and often sends us presents, he having with so many other of their governors promised, yea, subscribed obedience to our sovereign Lord King James, and for his cause to spend both strength and life. And we for our parts, through God's grace, have with that equity, justice, and compassion carried ourselves towards them, as that they have received much favor, help, and aid from us, but never the least injury or wrong by us. We found the place where we live empty, the people being all dead and gone away. That was the plague, historians say. And none living near by 8 or 10 miles. And though in the time of some hardship we found, traveling abroad, some 8 bushels of corn hid up in a cave, and knew no owners of it, yet afterward, hearing of the owners of it, we gave them, in their estimation, double the value of it. Our care also has been to maintain peace among them, and have always set ourselves against such of them as used any rebellion or treachery against their governors, and not only threatened such, but in some sort paid them their due deserts. And when any of them are in want, as often they are in the winter, when their corn is done, we supply them to our power, and have them in our houses eating and drinking and warming themselves, which thing, though it be something a trouble to us, Yet because they should see and take knowledge of our labors, orders, and diligence, both for this life and a better, we are content to bear it. And we find in many of them, especially of the younger sort, such a tractable disposition, both to religion and humanity, as that if we had means to apparel them and wholly to retain them with us as their desire is, they would doubtless in time prove serviceable to God and man. And if ever God send us means, we will bring up hundreds of their children, both to labor and learning. And that is his introduction to the sermon. And we get to Pilgrims in Perspective. Now we see good intentions by Cushman's people, but we also see that there's something lacking in respecting the inherent worth and dignity in who they called the savages. That they can be good if they take up the ways of the Pilgrims, not continue their own worldview. We've started to raise questions about the attitude of Cushman and so many who came after. The presumption of, weren't they nice to make room for us? And when we found there were owners of what we took, we paid what they think is double its worth, as if commerce will fix it. The doctrine of discovery dates to 1493 and was a papal bull. So there's some remove, but really only a little bit, between it and the colonization of New England. The doctrine of discovery is what established essentially the idea that land is open to the taking by Christians if the people on the land don't know about Jesus and haven't been converted to Christianity. The doctrine still seems to apply to New England and British colonization in the way that Christians arrived and settled in areas where other people with their own religions lived. Remember that the Mayflower Compact had as its first listed priority the voyage to plant a colony being for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. The Mayflower Compact and Cushman's words get to so much of today's reconsideration of what many of us took for granted as the American way. The newcomers even brought the name America. It's hard to read the compact without perspective of the way we've changed. That now we recognize the indigenous people had civilization and society. It's especially hard for those of us who live lives advocating compassion in community, and that ancestral immigration is more than a shared meal at harvest time where we cook food that the people already here showed us how to grow, and probably cook much better meals than we attempt. And the enslavement of Africans and their being transported to the area was beginning at the same time. In our own better nation, and here in Northwest Ohio, despite actions that government attempts at times, we welcome and make room for immigrants to our communities, perhaps recognizing that the colonizer models our forebears used weren't the best ways. And this year, maybe not quite as restrictively as last Thanksgiving, we'll give thanks differently, with more intimacy rather than in a crowd. May the harvest celebration nourish us to the health we need to minimize and eventually be able to resist COVID-19. The Pilgrims did have a vision of community. We can continue that, but it's not the same vision. We might do better if it's for the truth of the golden rule rather than for glory of divinity, for faith in one another rather than dependence on providence. We can learn from the past and be grateful for that past in all its complexity and complications. We can honor Pilgrims and Puritans, separatists, saints, and have the perspective that our world has grown from the world when they lived. Let's be in community in all its best senses. We can remember that 401 years ago, new people arrived on this continent and met people who were struggling against devastating illness. We're sick again. Let's recognize that it's in community that we can make the world better and its people, us, healthy, and that we have the science to do so with vaccines and not have to make the mortal sacrifices that so-called herd immunity requires. We're not a herd of humans after all, but people together, and isolating to preserve a future of togetherness. Be thankful, be grateful, be kind, so be it.
For the Beverly cluster, we thank you for tuning in to our virtual Thanksgiving service. May next year be in person with the congregation. Safe from exposure to disease, and until then, we urge you, please be vaccinated and keep your protection current with boosters if they are called for.
Our closing words are by Charles A. Howe. May we go forth from this place thankful for the life that sustains and renews us, and open to the grace that surrounds and surprises us. May we go forth from this place with openness and with thanksgiving. Amen.